Everything rises and falls on leadership. The ability to lead well is fueled by living your cause and purpose. This podcast will equip you with the tools to do just that. Live and lead with cause and purpose. And now, author of the book, The Anatomy of Leadership, and our host, Chris Comeaux.
Hello and welcome to The Anatomy of Leadership. I'm excited. Today's guest is a good longtime friend, Bruce Peters. Bruce is actually the founder and guide of Beyond Teal LLC. Welcome, Bruce. Good to have you.
It's good to be here as always. And I really enjoy your podcasts, Chris. I don't watch all of them, but I've watched many of them. So,
no, absolutely. And I appreciate your feedback. And as many of our listeners, I talk frequently about Dr. Lee Thayer because he was an amazing mentor in my life. That's actually how you and I got to know each other, was through Lee. And I feel in some respects, those who knew Lee always knew that he would challenge them to think about stuff. And I feel like in some respects, you have filled that role in my life in a good way. You ask me questions or challenging questions after a podcast, and I just really do appreciate that. And that spirit, I asked you to provide your bio and you refused. What's up with that?
Yeah, Chris, I mean, you asked the question and I thought to myself, it's interesting at this stage of my life, rarely when I'm asked for people who might want to engage my services, I no longer provide a bio or a CV. Because usually what happens is when people get to me, they've been referred by word of mouth or they were referred by somebody personally. And in the early days when that would happen, I'd have to be careful not to sell myself out of an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so I've gotten away from providing bios or providing CVs or even responding to RFPs. And it seems like the more I do that, the more work comes my way. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but,
right.
And I thought, well, I'd love to have that conversation with Lee because, as you know, Lee held all kinds of academic degrees and rarely would bring it up with somebody else
very rarely at all. I think I found out a degree he had towards the very end. I'm like, I didn't know you had that.
Yeah. And, where in the world that you and I play in, people are running around. If you look at the Vitae at the bottom of their email messages, it's like 17 pages long and all kinds of titles and all sorts of things. So anyway, but what I was looking for, the reason I sent that out to you, the first question you asked me about was my own superpower.
Yeah, we had an interesting discussion the first time. And so,
right.
Yeah, what do you want to say about that?
Well, then that took me, your whole question took me to that part of the conversation. And then I recall a conversation you and I had about Lee Thayer. Lee Thayer once said, most people misinterpret the reason for their success and their failure. Mm. And if that's true of other people, well, why isn't it true about Bruce or Chris? And so it caused me to say, well, wait, it's more important what other people think my superpower is than what it is. And the chances are very good I'm wrong about mine. So the question I had for you, you've asked that question of a whole bunch of people. And then you asked the second question is, why is it hard for people to do it? And I was wondering, you've been on the show for a long time, but how are people responding to that? Why are they responding? Why is it difficult to say that about themselves?
Yeah, but that's a good question, Bruce. Well, first off, I do prep them because I think it is such a difficult question. Where I originally got it from is I coached my kids' soccer team, and I grew up in Louisiana, and the only sport was football, pretty much. So I had to coach a sport I never actually played. Yeah. And a friend of mine actually told me, he said, "Ask." Yeah, exactly. I was actually pretty good because of probably exactly that reason. But I would ask the kids their superpower, and it was amazing how aware they were at such a young age before the world beat them up, and they lost touch with that. And so I think as adults, I think that's kind of the reality is that, the folks that have truly gained that self-awareness that know, this is part of my purpose and part of my unique offering to the world. And then when you do get to that place where you understand it at a deep level, there's almost a humility that comes with it. So it's like a very fragile thing that you want to put out to the world. And I think that's why it's a tough question for people to answer. And what I love about most of our guests, I feel like they will say it in such a way that they all realize they're a work in progress. And that gives me great hope for themselves and also for me.
Yeah, you just mentioned something that I had not thought about in a while, although I actually teach it. The last story I tell in my FLP program is my golf story. I was a reasonably good golfer, but I was kind of frustrated. I wasn't getting any better. So late in life, I decided to go take a lesson. The first lesson that I took, and I won't bore you with the whole story, although the story is quite a good one, mostly over a beverage late in the day. So, so if the very first lesson I go, and I'm going to take a series of 4 lessons every 2 weeks, and I'm going to get better at golf this summer. My wife bought me a subscription, and the pro happened to be a master golf teacher in Rochester by the name of Craig Harmon. Craig's brother was Tiger Woods' coach.
Oh, wow.
And the brothers were all head pros at championship level courses. Their father was Bobby Jones's coach at Winged Foot. And so,
wow.
So I go to Craig Harmon. I know, talk all the scratch golfers I know. I go to Craig Harmon. Craig Harmon hands me a club. I hope there's some golfers that are out actually listening to this. He hands me a driver and he says, hit it, go ahead and hit it. And I hit a few. He says, great, try it again. Great, try it again. So I try a few. He comes over, takes the club out of my hands, and he says, have you ever seen John Daly swing? Do you know anything about golf at all?
A little bit.
So
do
you know John Daly? Who John Daly?
Oh, yeah. I know who John Daly is. He crushed the crap out of it.
Yeah, and he just has the most unorthodox swing that any golfer's ever had, ever. And I said, yeah. And I'm looking at him kind of strange, like, why are you asking me that question? It wasn't a question I was expecting from the world-class pro. And he says, can you swing like John Daly? And I said, sure. And so he put the pin in the ground, and I take the wing, and I take this big whack, and I literally hit my rear end with the head of the club on the way by, spring it all the way through. And I almost missed the ball completely. It trickled off to the left. He says, great, try it again. He puts another one goes this way, one goes that way. One goes straight up, one goes into the ground. But I do this for about 20 minutes. He keeps doing it. He just says, great, Bruce, try it again. Great, Bruce, try it again. And pretty soon I'm hitting the driver 20 to 30 yards longer than I've ever hit in my life, and I'm hitting them all straight. And I'm swinging like John Daly. Now, he comes over, and Chris, I'm a coach, right? And so I think I'm a smart guy about this stuff. He comes over, and he takes the club out of my hands, and he says, Bruce, what did you just learn from that? I had no idea what I just learned from that. And he said, Bruce, there's a lot of ways to hit the ball long and straight. Golf is not a game of perfect. And then he told me to go try it, do it then. So I took a whole series of lessons, and I won't tell you the whole story of the lesson. But what he was teaching me in that first lesson was what you just mentioned, which is, as a kid, he was allowing me to be a kid again. How do kids play golf?
Oh, that's cool.
They just
go out and do
grip it, and they just grip it and rip it. So he didn't know what my potential was. And he sure as heck knew I didn't know what my potential was.
That's so cool. Wow.
And so,
Ooh,
so the work that you and I do in our own way is very often about that. It's helping people uncover and discover that version of them. And then where do you build on it, and how do you build on it? And so in my case, I learned an awful lot about this in kind of the rearview mirror. It's a little bit like purpose. If you were asking me what my superpower is, my superpower for me was my compass was always good for Bruce and his choices.
That's pretty good.
I always knew if I stayed true to that internal compass, to go left or right or up or down, and there were lots of times in life you get into those situations. When I stayed true to that compass, and I could always knew it was always there, then that was for me, that was the superpower. And then the superpower is how to pass that along to others.
Yeah. It's like the superpowers.
Yeah. I mean, that's what keeps you going. I mean, in a sense, that's what keeps me going. So, so anyway, so that's the
I love that.
The rest of the golf story is also wonderful, or I think it's wonderful, but I won't bore you with all that.
It actually sounds like a good adult beverage conversation.
I can tell you the conclusion the Saturday morning after the last lesson, I shot 69, tied the course record on the front at our championship course, shot 31, and I've never touched a golf club since then.
I love that. All
So
right.
what
Well,
else
this is
do I
going to
talk
be
about?
yeah, this is going to be an interesting segue. So you were being a really good agitator question asker to me. We had Tom Foster in our podcast twice. Love the work that Tom is doing related to Requisite Organization. And you just started kind of asking me some really good questions about like, so maybe the first question should be to you, Bruce, is you're familiar with Tom's work and Elliot Jax's work. Has it influenced your work over the years? Have you pulled that into your work?
I use it almost everywhere and everything that I do.
Okay.
But not quite the way that Tom does it, because I came to Tom's work later. And so, and I thank you for the question, because some of this history I'd actually forgotten. Now, it just kind of goes away into the memory bank somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had my business, I had 150 employees, and in 1997, 1998, and I took a class up in Toronto, Canada, on Requisite. I don't even remember who the people were. I went looking for my notes and that sort of thing. I was introduced to it by former clients. The father of former client of mine was the father of somebody who was later in my CEO group. And the father was an expert and sold consulting services in Toyota engineering. And his son became an advocate of that. And the father's name was Fred Flynn. The younger fellow was Craig Flynn. You probably run into Craig in Lay's World in that last event that I did down at North Carolina. Craig was actually there.
Oh, yes. Actually, yeah. Now I do remember
It's
that.
a little sad story. He's had some health issues, but Craig introduced me to the program. I went up to Toronto and I took the class. Now I took the class because I was I had a lot of conflict going on in my organization. I had lawyers, and we were designing a totally paperless process mortgage closing system in the 90s. If you called into my office in 1998, 1999, your file popped up on the screen. Everything that was happening on your file was there instantly. Everything was transparent. The systems were all there and available for that in that day and age, but nobody had really put it together the way we put it together. So they talked about it. They called it unified messaging or that sort of thing in those days. But I had conflict in my organization. I didn't know what the hell to do with the conflict. And so Craig says, this program will help you, Bruce, deal with the conflict. So I'm ready for any kind of panacea. I go 5 days in Toronto. And that's where I first got introduced to the ideas and to strata and to the whole thing. I learned it slightly differently than I'm hearing Tom and you come back and talk about it today. They were very much more rigid about it in my day. As far as they were concerned, nobody was a 6 or a 7.
Well, yeah, and it's very rare because you were working at usually like some type of government or international level.
But their thing, you didn't even talk about 6 and 7s. In fact, Colin Powell was a 7 or an 8, and he was the only one in the universe, and that was that. They also were very rigid about people not getting out of level 1s were level 1s their whole life. And they were not be able to mature. So you may have gotten more mature. So they were very rigid about that. However, what I recognized and what was my problem was I had lawyers who were technically competent running departments or areas of my business who were levels 2 or 3 in terms of how they looked at work. And I was hiring all these bright young people that were 4s and 5s working for them because of their technical expertise. And now I was in danger of losing all this talent, all this talent that I brought in, and we're all there because of the neat things we were doing. Yep. They're all going to run out the door because they're reporting to somebody that's above them.
So what did you do with that?
So what I did with that, and I couldn't do it right away, but I took that information. I said, it was like a blinding flash of the obvious to me. Like, of course, that's exactly what's going on. And I got the chance to talk to the instructors and some other people that were using it in the companies. And I came back to Rochester and I realized I didn't want to lose the technical competency of the lawyers, but I didn't want to lose the other people. So what did I do? I had long conversations with the lawyers about their job, what they enjoyed, how they didn't enjoy it, how they looked about work. I'm armed with all these questions from the program. And I basically let them keep their title and let them keep their salary, and I moved them into an independent contributor role.
Wow.
I couldn't do them both at the same time because it was very costly to do that. So
Right.
I made a plan for myself. I did one in 6 months. And then once that one worked, I figured out what's the easiest one to work. And then I'll do the next one. So 6, 8 months later, I did the other one. And 2 year period of time. Now, all of a sudden it flourished. And 2 years later, I sold my title company to a management buyout team, which is all these young people who had come in and were working for this lawyer that they were all going to leave.
Wow.
I had a secretary who ended up being the president of that title company after I sold it.
Did you just use titles so the titles were more for outside consumption than inside?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but I didn't use I didn't talk about Requisite anywhere. I just talked, I used it very pragmatically. I did not systemically change much of anything, except I moved those two people out of the way.
Mm-hmm. You recomposed your organization,
I just moved them out of the way.
Yeah. Which is now, my book about the anatomy of leadership is like, really just like a table of contents. But that whole chapter of composing the organization, intuitively, I know I was gone maybe 2 inches deep and that there's this other body of wisdom.
Exactly.
And I feel like it's exactly kind of what we're poking on, which maybe this is a good segue, Bruce. So you were one of the first to introduce me to the concept of a TEAL organization. Can you just talk about that a little bit? Of course, where I want us to go is then bring these two concepts together.
So the second part of me being reintroduced to Requisite was when I decided to leave Vistage. I went around, there were a couple people in the channel I had not heard speak. One of them was Jerry Harvey. And Jerry Harvey taught Requisite Organization at GW, and Elliot Jacks was a academic fellow staff member with Harvey at the time. And so I lined up with the tech chairs, who I knew most of them, and I went and I saw Jerry Harvey speak 5 or 6 times. About the 4th time I went to see him speak, we go out into the parking lot after the presentation. He looks at me and he says, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" in his West Texas drawl. And I said, "Well, this is the 4th time I've heard your presentation." And he said, "Why would you want to hear that?" And, so we got into I had a 4-hour conversation with Jerry Harvey in a parking lot in Potomac, Maryland or somewhere. So we got into the very tail end of the conversation. Jerry says to me, "Bruce," he says, "this is a wonderful conversation, but I got to leave." And he says, "I'm going to go meet Elliot." I said, "Are Elliot Jacks?" Because he talked about Elliot in his presentation. And he said, "Yeah." And he says, "Do you want to join us?" Well, I can't join tonight. I can't join. Yeah, but I couldn't do it because of other commitments. But he says, "Well, if you can't join us tonight, why don't you come to Elliot's retirement party over in Baltimore tomorrow night?" So I ended up at Elliot Jacks' retirement party in freaking Baltimore, Maryland. I mean, he was in a wheelchair at that time, and so I got a chance to meet Elliot Jacks in person. We didn't talk Requisite there. There was much more drinking than conversation going.
How old was he then, Bruce? Out of curiosity.
I don't know the answer to that. He was old for, I would say, old for his age. I mean, he was at his age, but he had some health issues, so that was ultimately the thing. So that caused me to be interested in it. And then I had conversations with Jerry about Jerry's thoughts about Requisite, and he has a wonderful chapter in one of his books, which I sent you a piece of. It caused me to go back and revisit it. So then, during the time that I was a tech chair, I had known about Tom and Tom's work, but I really had not used him. So after I left Vistage, I brought Tom in to do some work with a client of mine in Rochester. Mm-hmm. So we brought him in and we made him a speaker for a whole bunch of people. Well, it turns out the founder and CEO of that particular company fell in love with Requisite. But this guy, rather than hire Tom, what this guy did is he dove in for 3 weeks into the Requisite books, and he developed 3 teaching modules of his own, and he taught it back into his company.
Wow, that's a great way to own it.
Yes. Now, what he did was he took what I did and just went deeper with it as you were discussing. I stayed here at the superficial level. I solved my problem. I was gone, right? In his case, he went in and talked about, now I had been really good at getting them to have role descriptions and all the stuff you and I've talked about with Lee's work, but the ability to take the roles and to get requisite to the roles. And he literally did that with his team and never talked about strata. All he did was talk about the role.
Did he talk about levels of the organization?
No.
Okay.
He just got people in the room. What's your role? Da 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 da. What's the role before you? What's the role above you? What's the role this way? They created role descriptions, and they built that into a role description accountability process. And they never talked about strata.
Did he have to recompose the organization in the midst of doing that?
In some places, but not instantly.
Okay.
So
he more established like the principles, the lexicon, the language.
What it basically did is exactly what you're saying. They got common language. They got a real clear example of what the current state is. So he's not coming in and saying what it should be. He's coming in and saying, what is it? What are the existing roles that are being played? And so they got all of that on the table. And then he would take the descriptions from strata, from Elliott's book, the descriptions of the behaviors, and put the descriptions to the role and the person, match them up. So he would back into it.
What kind of company was this? Bruce, manufacturing?
This is the optics company that I worked with for 25 years here.
So just for our listeners, that would be a highly specialized manufacturing company, almost like a job shop, right, Bruce?
Prototype optics. And what your inquiry and listening to you and Tom, I went back and called, it happens to be Mike. I went back and called Mike and I said, Mike, go back and tell me a little bit more about what you did back in those days and why I resonated with you and what you did. And to this day, he's now retired from the company or moved on from the company. I did a little video call with him and I almost wanted you to be there. What he did is he had the 3 modules. He still had the 3 modules. And he said,
oh, wow.
He said, Bruce, it was the most important thing I ever did in my organization.
Wow. Maybe you need to pass me his contact information. Maybe you need to do a podcast with him.
Yeah. So anyway, I wanted to include that part of the story.
Yep.
Now,
so let's take it to the teal now. Yeah.
So the second biggest thing that Mike said to me that Bruce, you ever did for us was I introduced them to Frederick Laloux. So Frederick Laloux is the author of a book called Reinventing Organizations. And Reinventing Organizations is about 15 to 20 companies that are operating at a very high purpose-driven level and self-led and self-managed fundamentally. And the TEAL concept comes from the field of psychology. Way back in the late 40s and early 50s, there was a lot of academic work in the field of psychology matching up adult levels of development and behavior and development with child behavior and development. And they realized there were somewhere around 6 levels in adults the same way there were in kids. So you don't talk to a 2-year-old the way you do a 4-year-old, the way you do to a 13-year-old, if you can talk to a 13-year-old. So those stages were all color coded. And so the higher levels were teal, it was level 5, and turquoise was level 6. And so Laloux took that color coding and he labeled these organizations that he was talking about, high purpose-driven organizations, as teal level organizations. So he coined that phrase brought it over on the business side of things. Now, I met Laloux and I learned this from Lee. When I read the book, it was kind of eye-opening for me, and I could see Lee and Requisite in teal.
Yeah, let's not go there yet, right? But that is where ultimately I want to land the plane, is now bring all 3 concepts.
So as you and I both learned from Lee, I read the book and I went and found Frederick Laloux and I got him on the phone. And I get him on the phone and I said, I read your book and I actually want to change the name of my organization to Beyond Teal, and I don't want to violate any IP or anything like that. And he said, and he's got the most refreshing thing I've ever heard from a business person. He said, Bruce, do whatever you want. I'm more interested in creating a movement than I am in having economic success for me personally. And so I changed the name, and it turns out I said, I said, where are you now? He happened to be in Belgium at the time. And do you get to the States? He says, I just came back to the States, or back from the States. I said, are you coming back? And he said, yes. He says, I said, where are you going to be? He says, Ithaca. Now, you know where Ithaca is in relationship to me. And I said, are you going to be at Cornell? No. He and his family and his young children at that time were going to move to an eco village outside of Ithaca. And so this is a very humble guy who made a lot of money on the book. The first printing they did in Japan on the book, they sold 30,000 copies in one day.
Wow.
And outside of the U.S., he's like the wonderkin. He and his wife can't go to a restaurant in Paris and not have people. He's like Michael Jordan in Europe.
Wow.
And hardly known. He keeps a very low profile here in the States, and he's still down at Ithaca, the last I heard. In that conversation, he says to me, he says, you know, my best friend's from Rochester. And it turns out his best friends were a little town outside of Rochester called Brockport. So I contacted his friends. So I would drive down once a month and have dinner with Frederick, and we brought him into Optimax. And so he came into Optimax, and he married what Mike and Rick were doing in their company in Optimax with the TEAL concepts. And the piece that I didn't talk about when I learned at Requisite initially for me, the big focus in that original class in Toronto was Navy SEALs programs and the work at the War College. Because Jax taught there for almost 30 years, and Jax would take teams of 14 people, and they would win the war games against 140 people all the time. And the reason they were 3 levels: lieutenants, sergeants, and privates. And just 3 levels. Now, the work that you and Tom have been describing about that's above that might be being done by generals and other people. So what hill we're going to climb may be determined by somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But how to climb the hill was 3 levels. And if you think about it, they all knew the mission. That's the hill. They all knew each other's capabilities in these small teams. Bruce is good at this. He's not good at that. Everybody knows. So the munitions expert, everybody knows who's the best munitions expert. But on the team, there's always somebody who can back up the munitions expert. So they know the mission, but there's always a way. So if everybody gets killed except the last person, that person still knows how to fulfill the mission.
Thank you to our Anatomy of Leadership sponsor, Dragonfly Health. Dragonfly Health is also the title sponsor for Leadership Immersion courses. Dragonfly Health is a leading care-at-home data, technology, and service platform. With a 20-year history, Dragonfly Health uses advanced technology and robust analytics to manage durable medical equipment and pharmaceutical services as part of a single efficient solution for caregivers, patients, and their families. The company serves millions of patients annually across all 50 states. Thank you, Dragonfly Health, for all the great work that you do.
So look, just let me try to interject a couple of things, Bruce, and you clean it up if I get it wrong. So if we think about, I think some people hear the word TEAL just, because we live in drive-by, sound bites, blah, blah, blah. Oh, that's a leaderless organization. It's just kind of loosey-goosey.
Yeah, it's actually the highest level of accountability you could possibly imagine.
So it's not that there is no hierarchy in a TEAL organization. It's just maybe there's optimal minimum number of levels of hierarchy.
Yeah.
Would you say that differently?
But mostly those are in place to inform communication and how do we design the work and that sort of thing, as opposed to a power hierarchy, which is where Tom and I got into this. Why he's a little better at clarifying what he means by that.
Yes, he is actually.
Yeah.
And we know hierarchy is not very very PC.
How Elliott uses the word bureaucracy, which everybody gets very jerky about in this day and age, but he had a very specific meaning for that. I think that's the other thing that Mike reminded me before I started rediving into this myself. So, however, the thing about TEAL is like all work, it's the thing I love about Elliot's work is you get crystal clear about the what, by, when. And then you design the competencies and the work and the roles around the deliverable, the what, by, when. And that's why Navy SEALs teams are so functionally so great, is because everybody's real clear about the what, by, when. And they're clear about the roles. They're clear about the mission. They're clear, you know what I mean? And they know each other's competency. They know that they can trust each other. I mean, they do a whole bunch of things at that level.
Yeah, that's pretty profound. Knowing the what, by, when, and then that the players on the team are super competent, that the systems,
These
the
are
processes, the
virtuosos.
training.
They don't have non-virtuosos on the team.
Yeah.
And why do people want to be on those teams? Because they're playing with virtuosos.
So this is where it's difficult to go into an organization and do organizational change if it ain't that.
Yes.
There's not the basic building blocks in place then to go there right from the get-go.
Yes. Yes. And one of my superpowers, maybe an alternate power, is I don't like to do anything until I understand what's going on the ground. And so when I do TEAL, and makes me very different, and there's TEAL consultants all over the country. When I do TEAL and when I'm operating at my best, I believe that kind of high level is always happening in every organization in some way.
Describe what you mean, that high level.
That high performance virtuosity is happening somewhere.
Oh, gotcha. So you're doing your gimbal walk. You're going to where the action is, and so I'm going to kind of, here's what I'm commentating. You correct me. You are like this high level CSI leadership guru. So you can see things that you and I might be sitting in the same space watching the same thing, but because of this well of wisdom and tools, you might be seeing symptoms of a lack of communication or even a lack of the organization being requisitely structured just by watching where the action is. Would you say that differently?
But I don't do it to uncover that. My intent is to uncover where is virtuosity happening now.
Because why would you want to do that?
Because I want to get more of that.
And how do you get more of that?
I begin to ask them. It starts with them.
And because that replicates quicker than bad stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the only way, because if you do it from this way, the top down, so the question becomes, what's in the way of you exercising virtuosity? What resources do you need? Well, if you go deep into Lee's work talks about that capacitation and competency and all of that. And so very often we're having these conversations about the what, by, when, and how you get from here and the design of the work, without including the people who best know what the design of the work is.
Man, this just popped into my mind because I met, what was the gentleman I met on the airplane that worked for Optimax? That was such
he's their HR person, yeah.
Yeah, we started Bruce Peters? It was just so wild. But thinking about Optimax and just the highly specialization of their work, I think there's a corollary to healthcare because that high specialization. What do you do when that competency and knowledge doesn't exist in the organization?
It always does.
How do you go get it and bring it back?
It always does.
So say more about that.
It always does. This sounds like
is the answer like learning mode then? Because there's so much in the learning mode.
Yeah, no. What I do is you could go into any organization. Who's the best performer here? Everybody knows who the best performer is.
Mm-hmm. But what if when that best performer doesn't have the knowledge for some new mountain peak they want to climb? How do you bring that in?
Say, what do you need to learn? It starts with them. In other words, what you're doing is giving them tools in their toolkit to my thing is you're putting agency at that level. And the better you can, and there are some people who take agency over their own choices and decisions, whether you and I tell them to it or not. There are some people who will do a good job despite their leadership.
Do you define agency similar to learning mode?
Well, I think responsibility, to me, it's responsibility for their choices.
Okay.
And there are people who are leaving the nursing profession today, in droves.
Yep. Why do you think that is?
Well, in my mind, it's easy. they can't be the nurse kind of nurse they want to be. It's because they realize that they don't have they're not making choices in congruence with their ethics and their integrity, and they don't want to be in that spot anymore. And the industry calls it moral injury. I think that's bullshit. To me, it's they're being forced to make choices because of the pressure they feel. And so if you say it's moral injury is happening to them.
Can you contrast that, Bruce? What's the name of the organization that's TEAL in healthcare that you're pretty fond of?
Virtuosity in England. So what I'm doing is getting people to I had this conversation. I mean, I sound like a therapist sometimes. I had a conversation in this organization the other day, and tell me everything's wrong. I mean, I'm down at the line level. Tell me everything that's wrong here. They look at me like, you're an outside consultant. You want to know what's wrong here? I said, yeah. And sometimes they'll answer, sometimes they won't. But ultimately, I can get to the point where they start telling me, what else is wrong? 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 I'll make this list of that. When we get that list done, we'll never talk about this stuff again. If you come up with something new, I'm happy to listen to it. When I get to the end of the list, I ask the question, what can you do that you're not doing now? And some of them get deer in the headlights look, some of them, but ultimately they'll answer the question. I said, go do it. Will you go do it? Will you commit to go do that? Yeah, okay. Some reluctantly, some thankfully. That's what I mean. What happens at that level, at the level that the actual work and the value of the work is being created, you're moving them from a scarcity mentality into an abundance mentality. But you're getting them to understand that they actually have responsibility for the choices that they make.
That's good.
No matter how many bad things are happening here today, don't let anybody take away your power to make the choices that you can make.
Take it finally into like the intersection of Requisite Organization, TEAL, and then what Dr. Lee Thayer would teach.
Well, I think the requisite gives me the language to understand the roles at the level and the what by when. So I'm using that requisite language to understand their role and where are they in the organization and where are they. When I talk to them, almost invariably, Chris, I find, I know you know that there's a process that you can identify somebody's stratum. And most of the time, you can generally come up with an idea. So I'm talking with somebody, so I get an idea of their stratum. Now, you got a lot of people doing level 1 work that have level 3, 4, 5, possibilities. Organizations almost in a traditional hierarchical organization, those people are not going to get recognized unless there's a boss who's actually got line of sight or somebody who puts them under their wing and goes with them. But that's more anecdotal than part of the system. So one of the things I love about Requisite, once you identify that, then you can begin to assign work, and you know what I mean? You can get very strategic about where and how you grow, and they will want to take it on. And then what happens, Chris, is the genie gets out of the bottle. So they now feel better about the work that they're doing, and then the next level of people see them in a different way than they see them before. And so what I'm doing is, we create these read to lead programs in the organization. I refuse to lead a read to lead programs. But one company I work with has 9 read to lead programs. They got the union in there. They got everybody in there. They got finance working with. Now all of a sudden people are seeing each other in totally different ways and totally different things. And now you've created a whole true learning community. So
Something occurs to me, and I should have gone back and asked Tom this, but the first time Tom came is when I was at Four Seasons. He started his presentation with Izuzas's work, the life cycles, and basically it's startups. 75% of startups fail, and I've lived this being part of Telias, because once you understand the levels of work in a startup, like I was doing level 1 work as the CEO of the organization, I still have to jump down sometimes and do level 1 work. I have to resist the temptation of dropping down to level 1 when it's not the role I need to be playing at that moment. But here's my point. It occurs to me what Tom teaches in Requisite and what you teach at TEAL, the intersection of those two things is so critical for a startup to be successful. Because in that startup phase, it's almost like you have to ask at this moment, what level of work am I needing to perform based upon what needs to occur? Does that resonate, or would you push back on that?
I think it's absolutely true. And if you remember back, one of the reasons I mentioned the stages model, the stages, developmental stages, is all based on your perspective of the world. Your perspective when you're a level 1 adult is you're just out of college or you're a senior teenager or whatever. Your world perspective is so different than my perspective at this stage of my life. So there's a lot of parallels here between stages and Requisite and where you are. And we didn't get into it, but I mean, you really made me think about this a lot, about my own journey. And what I realized, my superpower changed at each level over time.
And so unpack it changed in what way?
Well, when I was working on the ketchup line at the canning plant in Swedesboro, New Jersey, I was the best line person that they had ever seen in their lives. Because I figured out, I mean, you were limited in what you could do, but I was never going to be down. I was going to have to get as many bottles as I could. I figured out how to be the top, I mean, all that. So I was it was level 1 work in most organizations, but I made it as high level 1 work as I possibly could.
That's so one of the things, maybe a way to restate what you just said. It was actually in a Vistage presentation. You probably know the guy because this day I can't remember it, but it's the vision of the eagle. When the eagle flies, they see the horizon, but they also look down for their food at the same time. I use that continually as an analogy that looking at the horizon, infinity times looking down, infinity times infinity is infinity. At any moment, there's an infinite number of new visions, new programs, etc., but there's also an infinite number of improvements in what actually needs to occur now. So every level, even at level 1, there's infinity times infinity.
Yes.
So, and you may have said, you know what, I want to make the rest of my life here on the ketchup line, and I may reinvent what the ketchup line looks like.
The thought never entered my mind. I was just going to do it the best way I could do it. If whoever did this, I was going to do it better. And but I was hardwired that way at each level. When I was a young lawyer, I was going to bill more hours than anybody else. You know what I mean? There's a hard wiring in all of that. The what by when was different. The watch by when was different. So in my case, the other thing that go back to the superpower thing, one of the reasons why I think I can be successful in the way I described to you is that because I've been along all those paths, I can stand in other people's shoes. I can't be in their shoes, but I can have empathy for where they are in their stage of the journey.
And do you think that, like thinking about because we're having an interesting debate within TCN about how to apply the levels of work to TCN, because we're kind of a unique organization. Like I may be playing level 1 work in TCN that feels like level 3 or 4 work to the organization we're working with. Like think as a consultant. And so, that feels similar to what you just said. Like you may be sitting there in that person's shoes empathetically, and so you're getting on the same level, level 1, as far as the work that they're doing, but you're drawing upon superpowers that are more level 4.
But I have to. But in relationship with them, I have to meet them where they are.
And it's interesting, though. You're recalling, making me recall when Tom presented. He would talk about, level 5 leaders using this like very like futuristic language. And the level 1 person is like, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. And Lee would always talk about the thing about Patton that was so amazing is Patton could speak directly to where the foot soldier would matter to them.
Correct.
And you challenged me. I actually still have a little sticky on a weekly basis I look at. And you challenged me very similarly about, when I speak in my vision language, how does that really resonate with what's most important to the people who are doing the work? Can you remember exactly how you put it? Because I'm paraphrasing it. You had a very succinct way of saying that.
I'm not sure what question you're thinking about, but I'll tell you the one that came in my own mind. the people who are working in your organization with the families, in my mind, that's not level one work.
Good employers know that health benefits can make or break your business. But while employers are looking out for their employees' best interest, who is looking out for theirs? Sona Benefits is an independent pharmacy benefit manager who partners with employers to optimize their pharmacy benefits while supporting their business goals. But by offering no-spread pricing, contract guaranteed rebates, and the Sona Max program, clients are regularly able to save 20% to 35% off their total drug spend. The result? Pharmacy benefits that improve employees' well-being and employers' bottom line.
The person who's sitting with a family where a principal is in a hospice, to me, that's not level one work. I think it's 3, 4, or 5.
It's interesting. We've had a kind of similar, but not framing it that way. So the way the organization is structured, that is the level one work. That's the production line. But what I feel like you're poking on is the superpowers or just competency it takes to do that well.
Yeah.
Is much more systemic thinking.
This is not checked by the numbers. In fact, the danger of it being a checklist kind of a level one activity is it's not filling the needs of the people you're trying to fill the needs for.
So maybe this is just all getting lost in the lexicon, but when you brought in the Navy SEALs analogy, like a foot soldier versus a Navy SEAL, there's a very different level of competency between those two.
Correct.
Probably a hospice worker is more akin to a Navy SEAL in terms of skill level. So are you and I getting lost? Like, I think if Tom was with us, he'd still say, no, that is the level one. It's just the level one of this type of organization. The competencies required are much more robust. Or is that incorrect based upon how you learned?
I don't know the answer to that. And that's the reason I raised the question. And I raised it because of the Jerry Harvey conversation with Jax about associations are different than a bureaucracy. I do not know the answer, but it raised that question in my own mind. And that's why I wanted to revisit my own background and own experience. My experience of doing Requisite is, you've taken a much deeper dive. My client, Mike, took a much deeper dive than I did. I was interested in it and I liked the application of it, but I used it in a very limited way. I just have this sense that work at that level is not level one work the way I learned level one work.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing. But take it to what you do know. Look at Optimax. If I'm working on the line at Optimax compared to working at the line at the ketchup factory, my guess is the competency level of those two employees is different. Is that not true?
In some cases. And so they have, I just had a meeting yesterday with a small group that are in a line. So they're doing flat glass, big optics, flat glass. And there are people in that group, and I've talked with 10 or 12 people in one team. There are people in that team who can't get beyond the lens that's right in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
There are other people on the team doing the same work, basically, who understands what happens before it gets into the team, and they understand what happens after it gets into the team.
But doesn't it come down to this, Bruce, is what's the role? What's the role that's needed?
Correct.
And how you design the role, and what's the accountability, what's the authority? I love what you said, the what by when.
Correct.
The competencies.
Correct. Now, what they don't do there is that team ends up being more organized like a Navy SEALs team than it would be another team, because they have people there who are that kind of, they're threes, doing one work, but how they organize the team and the group ends up being a mini version of a Requisite organization.
I don't know if have you done a deep dive on the hill? Is it Bergsarg or Herksarg?
Beardsarg, yeah.
Bergsarg, it's with the B. So if you've done a deep dive on them, because that's kind of a corollary to hospice and palliative care, what does it look like amongst their clinical teams?
I have not.
Okay.
I have not. And the only reason obviously because we have a relationship and I know you and your work, and it's always struck me about your work is quality of the person doing that care and how much they care about being with a family in that environment and doing the work, but doing the work in such a way as it maximizes things, relationships and things in the family.
Well, you just made me, I just had a huge aha. The patients in hospice and palliative care are generally have a prognosis of 6 months or less, which is kind of interesting because then that gets to more of like level 2. But so a great hospice person will meet that patient and family where they are and will walk alongside them in that journey. They will bring skills and tools, clinical, pain symptom management, but that ability to meet and walk alongside them and help them discover what's most important to them and then coordinating amongst other team members to deliver that. That's like a Navy SEAL. I mean, that's like super duper powers.
Yeah,
that's beyond, let me give you an aspirin and give you a shot.
It's not level 1 work the way I learned level 1 work in Toronto.
But I think in terms of what Tom teaches, though, I think he would come in and say, you're defining level 1 work as almost like a very non-complex task level thing. Like, if I love my father-in-law, he's amazing. He was in basically a machine repair shop of a manufacturing line his whole life. And so while there's probably certain levels of complexity, it's not quite as complex as what we're dealing with within hospice. So maybe the more efficacious way is level 1 does not connotate how much competency and complexity. It's just very specific to that organization. Because when you start looking at level 2 and level 3, it's about systems and processes and then integrating those systems and processes. You're thinking it at a human level, and yes, that does exist at the level 1. So I don't know if you'd push back on that.
I did. As I said, I just, the fact that we were going to meet and that it caused me to go look at this, and I would have a tendency to believe that that's not level 1 work under any circumstance that I could define.
Maybe we'll go back to the source of Tom and kind of see what he says.
I just said I knew you and I were going to be talking about it because for all the reasons you just mentioned, it's connection. It's a bunch of things, the worldview and how they connect and the way they're doing. They're like the CEO of that family's life during that 6 months.
Well, you just gave me a cool idea, actually, which, we do this in our org chart at Telias. I'm at the bottom of the org chart, and our admin team hates me for it. Like they have to do it in a software, and it has to flip it upside down.
Exactly.
And so, and I'm not doing it for like cliche.
It's like really publish this.
No, but to your point, what if you actually took the levels of work and just flipped the actual pyramid? Because the most important people are the people at the level 1. And that to me is probably more TEAL-based thinking, right? Or beyond TEAL-based thinking. You're also making me recall, we had a meeting, Lee, and we had like our own kind of CEO group that Lee would facilitate. And he came in on a Monday and he was almost giddy. And he had seen a college football game that weekend with the Johnsonville Sausage Company. And there was the marketing commercial. There was the staff level people sitting at a table going, well, now they want us to come up with a commercial. And Lee was like, they're finally getting it.
Yeah, there you go.
It really was kind of flipped upside down. The people that were doing the actual work were having to come up with a marketing message.
Yes. And I think even if I'm wrong, it's a better way to look at your work.
Well, that's what's kind of occurring to me is just like you had brought us into a fascinating conversation. I can't remember the name of the organization, but what they talked about was think of where the work needs to occur as these circles, and you bring people into the circles.
Yeah.
And what I remember, the first thing I remember thinking of was then I want a team of Navy SEALs, highly ambidextrous, highly trained and competent. And theoretically, if you did that ideally, you wouldn't need any structure. It's just the CEO and just all these circles.
And Beardstar's got 30 people and 20,000 employees.
But if you agreed, and so you get optimal, but there is still people that have level 3 and 4 responsibility.
But it's like Navy SEALs. There are people who have that, but they're not in the performance.
What they're doing is they're dropping in and they're helping, like, hey, our system's no longer working anymore. Can you help us change the system, update the system? these systems aren't talking and working with each other. It could be a process system, could be a technology system, et cetera.
Yeah, and they're directional. I mean, it's we're going north, or we're going west, or we're going south, or we're going to take this mountain. Because you do not get that from the organizational structure of Requisite. Somebody's making a decision about we're going west. And I think the Navy SEALs team, Birdsorg takes it a step further, although I think Navy SEALs do this. Their role of the corporate headquarters and the people above, their role description is to make sure that the circles have competency to perform their roles.
That's interesting.
Right. And so it's not to make it hierarchical in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
But are they free to make the decisions? And you got some circles splitting their money equally, and you got other circles who are very different about it. But what they're not flexible on is the quality and the service of the work that we're doing.
Well, Bruce, we probably could go on hours. Why don't you land the plane? What final thoughts you think would be a good way to tie all this together?
Oh God. I think you're really onto something, but I really I appreciate the opportunity to come in and kind of watch from the outside, because you're wrestling with what hundreds of organizations are wrestling with in the current environment, and the current uncertainty is everywhere in our society for whatever reason. And so one of the things I love about Requisite, and this goes back to Jerry Harvey viewed it as being a cure for analytic depression.
Say it one more time. A cure for?
Analytic depression.
What's anaclinic?
Analytic depression.
Sorry, what does that mean?
Analytic depression is depression that's caused by separation.
Oh, wow. And might be misdiagnosed as a lack of cause and purpose.
Correct. Could be a whole bunch of things. But if you go back and restudy Jerry, the whole idea of his work was to manage meaning and maximize connection. And so, which goes back to Wilford Beyond, but he would say, like in the concentration camps in World War II.
But Frankel.
But in the concentration camps, people would die. And when people died, they crawled up in little balls, and most of them died from pneumonia or not from any particular physical ailment they could not put on them. They died of loneliness, essentially. And because they were disconnected from their society, their families, their friends, they're disconnected. Everything was important in their world. All of that is a cause of analytic depression. Way back in the old days when kids were in the orphanages and they didn't get held at birth and all that sort of thing, people who got through that had analytic depression their whole life. They couldn't get married, couldn't make relationships, couldn't make friends, and that sort of thing. The thing that you're seeing in our society today is a mass of analytic depression. We do not know how to be in relationship and connected to each other. And so one of the things that Requisite does is allows a formula in the business world. It creates a formula for how you create some structure that's not chaos and reduces uncertainty about what we're going to do and how we're going to work and play together.
That's incredible. You know, Bruce, I was in a meeting the other day. Do you know there's a minister of loneliness now in England?
Yes. Yeah. Very much so. And you know what the biggest program is they have?
No, what is it?
Woodworking shops for men. They have 400 of them.
Oh my gosh.
And what they learned is men get together around the thing and then they become friends. Women get together as friends and then they decide what we're going to go do together. And so the big initial thing that created this in England was the woodworking shops. So
that's so cool.
Yeah. And so there's like 400 of them now. They got a little woodworking association. Every little town has its own woodworking association. So, anyway, this is a very long-winded conversation, but I hope this is helpful to you. It's very helpful.
It is very helpful.
You forced me to rethink, and revisit some things for my end of things too. So.
Yeah. So what I think, what I'd love to do is actually bring you and Tom together. We've been having Tom mentor a team of ours because I want to say this out loud on the air. you look at a lot of organizations today, especially in healthcare, that have become overbloated bureaucracies. They're not requisitely structured. And then the work, you end up with nurses that are very disengaged from their work, but a lot of other things. This has happened in the healthcare, the hospital systems. And I am concerned in the hospice and palliative care field that as you start to see a lot of mergers and acquisitions, we're doomed for exactly the same thing. And that's why I'm so passionate about what you and I are talking about, because I think this is part of the antidote to make sure what I think is the most brilliantly model ever designed of healthcare thrives into the future.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that I worry about, and you see this all the time, like when people say you're working in a teal space, and I had to be careful about that, and is that people say, oh, that's flat management, or that, so people get it into buckets or categories. What I love about Requisite is it has buckets or categories, but the buckets or categories are designing around the work.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think the big thing I would worry about if I worked for you, I'd worry about, does the accountant of Chris come in and look at this stuff, because it's very attractive to people who think like accountants.
Mm-hmm. Right. Then it comes down to how you design the role.
Correct.
Which is kind of interesting. You would take it into that realm. So,
You know,
well, Bruce, you're a treasure.
So it's the standing in the shoes of the people that are doing the work.
Right.
Some way, somehow, make sure that they're involved in whatever it is you design. Thank you.
Wow. Well said, Bruce. That's a great way to land the plane. Appreciate you. You're a treasure. And so to our listeners, thank you for listening. In the end of each episode, we always want to share a quote and a visual, possibly might create a brain bookmark, a thought prodder about our podcast subject to further your learning and growth and thereby your leadership. And we want it to stick like a brain tattoo. Make sure you subscribe to our channel, The Anatomy of Leadership, so you don't miss an episode. Be sure to check out the book on Amazon, Anatomy of Leadership. Tell your friends, family, coworkers, pass this podcast, subscribe, hit the subscribe button, pay it forward to them. It's easy to rail against the world and be frustrated by things. Let's be the change we wish to see in the world. So thanks for listening to the Anatomy of Leadership, and here's our brain bookmark to close today's show.
Every one of us has a different narrative. We must be tending the garden on an individual level. By Bruce Peters.